George Papandreou is a former Prime Minister of Greece, and George Papaconstantinou is one of the country's former finance ministers. Both men were in power during the first bailout. And of course, gentlemen, I remember the effortless work that you put in, the hours of dedication to keeping your country from going off the brink. Let me start with you, Mr. Prime Minister. Seeing where things are today, are things better than you would have expected them to be, or worse, all these years later?
I would have liked, well, thank you for the question. Yes, we were at the brink of bankruptcy. We were able to stop that. Unluckily, it would be a great day to celebrate, but I don't think we can celebrate. I think, as you mentioned in your program, the costs has been huge, 25% loss of GDP, huge unemployment, a continual sense of insecurity over these years. I think we could have done this with much less pain, much quicker, and of course, I think we also still need to further deepen the reforms in our country. I would say that the only justification of this, of course, is that in the very beginning there was we were in uncharted waters in the European Union. No country really knew how to deal with this. The European Union had never dealt with this, neither had even the IMF dealt with something within a currency zone. So this was, of course, a trial and error in the beginning. Unluckily, there was also a sense of punishment that Greeks had overspent. We did have our problems. We did have our responsibilities. The previous government, before I took over, had ballooned the budget deficit and doubled the debt. Yes, but then we were there making deep reforms. And I think rather than having more solidarity from the European Union, there was a sense that we had to be punished. And Greek people have taken the brunt through these sacrifices. I think we could have done it much more easily. Still, there would have been pain, but we could have come out much more quickly. There's one other point I would like to make is that I think compared to other countries such as Ireland, Portugal, and Cyprus, we did not have the political consensus inside Greece, which was there in those countries. And I think that played an important role in not giving the support, but also the credibility to the global markets and the European Union.
Yeah, that's an understatement. We all recall the protests and the fires that we would witness there almost on a daily basis on the streets of Athens. Mr. Finance Minister, let me ask you this, because we talk about the country turning a page now, maybe very slowly, nonetheless turning a page, but you have a third of the population of 10 million people near poverty. Unemployment has fallen, but it's still at 19.5%, the highest in the Eurozone. What can be done to avoid a dark or a lost era and decade like we saw in Japan in the 80s?
Well, if you look forward, the main problem the country will have is that nobody gives it growth prospects exceeding 1.5% a year in the long run. That's really slow. It's too slow to repay the debt. It's too slow to create jobs. It's too slow to increase people's incomes. And the only way to do better than that is to have massive inward foreign investment, and together with it, something like a productivity revolution. That's the only thing that will save Greece. Because as it looks at the moment, we're going to be going on a slow growth road, which will simply not be able to bring back what Greeks have lost over those years. And make no mistake, given the situation where we were 8 years ago, 9 years ago, a lot of what happened was completely unavoidable. But it's true, just like Mr. Papandreou said before me, part of it was avoidable. Part of it was due to mistakes made both on the Greek side and on the part of our European partners.
Mr. Finance Minister, let me ask you about the other crises that are continuing to play out throughout Europe. You've got Brexit. Obviously, you've got the economic crisis in Turkey. What has you most concerned as an expert and as somebody who's taken part in an economic crisis?
Well, we are now 9 years since the Eurozone crisis started. We realized too late that it was not just a problem of one country, Greece. We had a systemic problem having to do with the architecture of the euro and the financial architecture of the Eurozone. This was a discovery that came too late. We started repairing the house. We have done a number of things, but we haven't yet been able to say that we have created an environment which can withstand the future crisis better than it did the last one. Because remember, today, for example, debt levels are higher everywhere than they were before. We have now mechanisms to deal with crisis better, but we're still susceptible. So whenever we think of Italy and its debt level, whenever we think of Turkey destabilizing the whole region, it is very easy for the whole of the Eurozone to succumb to a repeat of the crisis. And that's because we were not courageous enough at the European level to complete the banking union, because the problem with the banks was at the core of the Eurozone crisis, to move much further in the fiscal union and to have a truly economic union, which is as it was supposed to be designed in the first place.
And to add to that, you have the uncertainty coming from the U.S. and the president's tariffs as well with European traders. Mr. Prime Minister, let me finally ask you.
Indeed.
Let me ask you about your thoughts on how one of your successors, Mr. Tsipras, is doing now in his job as Prime Minister, running the country. Do you have faith in the direction that he's taken the country thus far and going forward?
Well, let me just add to the previous comment that George Papandreou made. Europe showed that when it worked together in unison, for example, when Mario Draghi came out and said, we will do whatever it takes, we actually calmed the markets. So I think what came out of this is that, on the one hand, Greece said, we want to remain. We're not leaving Europe. We believe in Europe, despite the fact that we think things should change. But on the other hand, that we must believe that Europe does have the capacity. We slowly built up some mechanisms. We haven't completed this project. We need to do more. And I think more Europe is what will be able to help us mitigate some of the global crises, whether it's called the refugee crisis, whether it's dealing with internet privacy, whether it's dealing with financial crises or pandemics or whatever. I think we need to see from this experience that going back to the populist, nationalist view of solving our problems is not going anywhere. We're not going to solve climate change or the refugee issue by going it alone. I think that's the first thing. I think the second point that you asked me about, well, we are paying dearly for particularly the first few months of the Tsipras government. We avoided bankruptcy in 2010. We almost went to bankruptcy in 2015 with capital controls on the banks, almost left the euro. And that cost Greece. It cost Greece in credibility, it cost in more borrowing, and it cost in more recession and therefore more cuts to be able to deal with the budget deficit. Obviously, after that, Tsipras fell in line, but as he was an anti-adjustment program, he didn't really have much else to do. So when he did fall in line, I believe he missed an opportunity to go deeper into making the necessary reforms for Greece. My belief is that austerity was emphasized. We needed to do deeper reforms. I'll just give you an example. When we brought in transparency through e-prescriptions in the medical sector, we cut graft that cost by 50%. That's 3 billion. We cut that's as much as we make in property taxes in Greece. So there are ways that we should have had more emphasis on reform, less emphasis on austerity. That's partly the European and the IMF blame, and partly, of course, blame of successive governments that were not really committed to deal with vested interests and make the changes necessary. That's what we need to do now.
Well,
I think now we think about the roots of the crisis. It's a new phase, but we need to move forward to make Greece, and Greece has great capacities, a sustainable economy.
A new phase and nonetheless a big milestone as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.